Hey guys, Michael Sanchez here on my porch, hanging out outside. Thought I'd do a class out here today. So today's class, I'm going to be answering your questions based on what you guys posted on the Adult Violin Learning page. So I have a list of about 10 questions, and they're all going to be organized from beginner level down to intermediate, and then we have a couple advanced questions as well. So at the beginning of this, if you're more advanced, you're probably going to want to maybe just grab a coffee and come back, as the first few questions might be a little bit on the easier side. But yeah, we have a really great set of really good questions, so I'm sure you guys will enjoy this class. All right, so I'm going to start with the first question, and it's from Alexander Force. He asked this on the Adult Violin Learning page. And Alexander says, I almost always have at least one bow bounce after bow resets. So do you have any advice for that? So Alexander, I'm not sure exactly what you mean by bow reset. Basically, you know, anytime you're playing the violin, you should always be, having the same technique all the time, to where it doesn't matter technically if you start here or if you start up here. You should be able to sort of get started properly based on, how you're applying the muscles in the hand. So what I tell students a lot of times is when you're, say, at the tip, the way that you can sort of get started with a nice clean bow stroke when you're, say, at the tip or any place, try to put a little bit of pressure down into the bow stick and then sort of release whenever you're ready to start the bow stroke. Okay, so I'm going to tighten my bow a little bit here. So go ahead and just try this a second. So take your bow, put it at the tip, sort of put a little bit of pressure down into the stick, and I want you to start with a nice clean sound like this. Like that, okay? And then just sort of practice stopping and then restarting again like this. Like that. So what I'm doing is when I'm sort of stopped, I'm sort of clamping down into the bow so that, I'm not getting any sort of outside noise. I'm stopped. And then when I'm ready to start up again, I sort of manage it with my index by sort of letting go a little bit and then sort of letting it go. And that allows me to get that clean sound after I'm stopped. Hope that makes sense. So you guys could just practice maybe even scales like this. So like... like that. So I highly recommend maybe for you guys to work on that. Next we have a question from Jessica Stokes. Jessica says, I was wondering why the violin is taught in first position, then third, etc. What would happen if it was taught on one string at a time where someone knew all of the notes on the entire string before moving on to another? Would there be any advantage to this? Yeah, so technically, Jessica, you can learn violin all in first position for the most part. For those of you guys that don't know, first position is basically playing any notes that are in this hand position to where I don't actually move up. So basically you can play quite a bit of things in first position. A lot of fiddlers actually don't even shift up into a higher position. The only time you really have to do it is when technically you have notes that are higher and higher up, which would take you having to put the hand up here. But normally for the first couple years, I encourage students to sort of master first position and then eventually learn third. Now the one thing that should answer your question and sort of give you more insight to this is that it does sound a lot better when you learn third position in various circumstances. For example, let's say I have a passage that plays a few notes on the A string and then sort of jumps to the E string for one note and comes back like this. Okay. Now technically that worked, but it would have sounded a lot better if instead of me playing those last few notes in the E string, I would have shifted up into third position. So instead of, sorry, that actually wasn't a bow bounce, that was me hitting my bow against the chair here. It would sound better to go like that. So that kept me on the same string, on the A string. So basically the rule of thumb is that you want to avoid crossing strings as much as possible on the violin. Anytime that you can avoid it by shifting, it's going to sound a lot better. So it's really good to learn third position, I would say, after a couple years of playing. And there's a lot of books out there and exercises that allow you to learn it properly. So definitely don't limit yourself, especially if you're trying to learn classical violin. At some point I would definitely recommend learning third position and then fifth position. and then eventually doing second and fourth position. So that's sort of the progress that I recommend: first, third, fifth, second, fourth. If you guys are wondering why, second position is, not really as needed, with sort of beginning pieces, whereas third position kind of expands you a little farther, and that's sort of the first position that most teachers teach first. So after first. All right, let's go on to the next question. Boy, it's hot out here. Daniel says, can you discuss some of the techniques that are a little bit more open to personal preference, particularly in the left hand? Your videos, you mentioned that you have to have your hand high and knuckles up, while everyone I've talked to seems to agree with knuckles up, but even Diane mentioned that you should have your hand a little lower. Some people might be having trouble staying within a strict set of techniques, not knowing if they can adjust a little bit. Good. So yeah, Daniel, I always just say knuckles up as high as possible, because a lot of students just sort of always have their hand way too low. So having hand way too low would be sort of considered, way down here, to where, I couldn't reach that G4 even if I tried with just my finger, right? See, I'm short. So having the hand in just the perfect hand position as far as height is really important. But you're actually right that it shouldn't be too high to where, it's sort of uncomfortable, and, to where even, like the first finger on the E string is sort of above where it should be. So this is what I normally tell students that ask this question. The first finger on the E string should just be, when squeezed like this, when it looks like this, it should be just touching the instrument. Okay, so right here, see how this is too high? See that space down, not touching the fingerboard? So I want to come just a little bit lower than that. But the thing I always tell students, knuckles up, is because most students just have it too low. And that really causes problems. So technically, yeah, you want to be in the optimal hand position as far as height. And the way that I teach this is, as far as exactly how high, is having students do this. Play first finger on the E string and play fourth finger on the G string at the same time. If you can do that, that's the perfect hand position. That's not going to be too high or too low. Good. So yeah, I think every teacher would sort of agree with that concept, that philosophy. They definitely wouldn't say, the higher, the better, like high is perfect. It's just a matter of how high, but 95% of students are like too low as far as their hands. So good. And then yeah, the other thing that's really important is not just height, but finger angles. A lot of students, have their finger angles more here, and that makes it really challenging. So you want to make sure that you're not just high, but you're back. Okay, so you want to be here, you want to be back and high. Good. Yeah, and then sort of to answer your question about which techniques you just sort of have a little bit of room with, Daniel, it's a really good question. Really just every technique is important in some way, shape, or form. Every teacher would recommend, bending the wrist, coming up bow. Every teacher would recommend, using small muscles in the hand. There's a lot of things that, just sort of take, eventually building the right process to where you're able to do those things. But, I would never look at it as, you have some more leeway here or there. Just try to go towards, the optimal, and you'll find, good progress, if you're just on the right path. So obviously you're not going to be perfect as far as your technique, especially if you're just starting. But, the more that you work on it, the better. So yeah, I think you have a question here in a little bit. Actually, the next question, let me just go to that. Daniel says, in your experience, how close should you be to the fingerboard regarding your left palm? My Skype teacher says there should be just a little bit of space between the palm and the edge of the fingerboard. I've been finding it difficult to do that regarding my thumb and fingers. So basically, Daniel, what you're talking about is how close my hand should be to the fingerboard. Your teacher's saying more that there should be a little bit of a gap there. I actually think it's not as good to have any sort of space, because the hand touching the fingerboard allows us to really feel how far we have to go for a shift. Okay, so if we have a space there, so we're trying to be away from the instrument, I think that's not as effective, because then you really only have your thumb sort of feeling how far to go for a shift. I really rely heavily on both my hand touching and my thumb. What your teacher might be saying though, Daniel, is that you might be pressing too hard. That's really common for students to press too hard, and that's hard to sort of move. And that relates a lot to how you're holding the instrument. So we have to make sure that we're holding the violin properly, and then not clamping too hard, just enough to where you're getting a smooth feel when you start to shift, okay? So one thing you guys could practice is just taking the hand and just sort of moving it back and forth, and sort of just feel the neck. Don't have any restrictions. If you're restricted, you're grabbing too tight. Okay, so good practice would be, you know, like third position drills. So right there, my hand was touching the whole time. It just wasn't grabbing really tight. I have to be able to feel that shift, that sort of smooth motion. Great, by the way, I'm right in the sun, guys. You guys might be wondering why my eyes are sort of squinting. My wife was working inside and my assistant was downstairs, so I sort of had to go outside. I got kicked out. So hopefully you guys can still hear me okay and see me okay. Just a matter of me not being able to really see what you guys are saying. All right, yeah, so that sort of concludes the beginner section of today's class. Let me go on to some more intermediate concepts. So the first one is from Wesley Chan. Wesley says, could you give tips on doing the martelé and staccato bow strokes? So yeah, martelé, basically, for you guys that don't know, is more of a non-short bow stroke. It's sort of an in-between legato and staccato. Staccato is real short, like this. This would be legato, just normal, smooth. So martelé would be in between that, would be. Staccato would be like that. So it's basically different types of articulation in music, and they're represented by, for staccato, you'll see a dot over top of the note. That means it's real short, a note that you play. Technically, if you have a staccato quarter note, it would mean basically that you're playing like an eighth note and then resting for an eighth note. So eighth